Welcome to the second video in the AngularJS Sandbox bypass series. In the previous video, I have provided a quick overview of AngularJS. Now we'll dive right into AngularJS internals by debugging why alert in an AngularJS expression doesn't work. The research I'm showing off here was not done by me. I built upon the research done by other people, most notably Mario and Gareth. I have not found an AngularJS Sandbox bypass myself, but I understand them now, so I want to pass on this knowledge. Now let's execute the expression with the alert by submitting this form. The site loads, executes AngularJS, the expression gets evaluated, and we hit our first breakpoint. The first breakpoint is hit in a function called getterFN, that means getter function. You can see that in the call stack to the right. I've also added some comments here. GetterFN is a function that creates a string with some JavaScript code. The variable with that code is called code. And because we hit a breakpoint, we are currently in that context. So we can access this variable code in the console and look at what it contains. You can also see that it somehow includes the alert that we used in the expression. It looks like this code checks if alert is a property of S or K and tries to get that property from S or K. And right below the breakpoint, you can see a call to the function constructor. The constructor is called with S and K, meaning those are the variables that should be known inside of the function. And third parameter is finally the JavaScript code as string. So this function constructor is fancy JavaScript stuff that creates now a function with two parameters S and K with the code that was created as a string. And that function could then be actually be called. So that function contains some dynamically generated JavaScript code trying to get the property alert of S or K. Let's quickly make an example what getting the property means in JavaScript. So here's a simple object A with two properties B and C. You can now check that A has the property B, but not the property F. And you can access the property's value with .b or in brackets. That's the same. Also, the object A automatically has the function toString. So functions are also just properties on an object. Instead of getting a value like 1, you get a function back. Call it by adding the parentheses for the function call. Okay, so this getterFN function in Angular creates a new function which tries to get the property alert from an object passed as parameters S or K if executed. Let's see what happens when we continue in the code. The next breakpoint is hit and we are now in a function with the name _function_call. This function prepares arguments for a function to call. Our expression attempts to call a function alert, so that makes sense. Our first argument of our alert is the number 1. So this function parses the parentheses with the arguments and creates an array args with all the parameters. And args is now an array with only one element, the number 1. Below our breakpoint, you can see a call to a function called fn with the scope as the first parameter. That's the Angular app scope we have talked about earlier. If that would return nothing, no op will be used instead. So what is fn? Fn is a short function calling another function, getter. When we click on getter, we can see what getter is. Getter is set here as the result of getterFN. And we know what getterFN does. GetterFN creates a function that tries to get the property alert of an object. So getter is now that function. And getter is basically fn. And fn is called with the scope. So all this fn calls tries to do is to get the property alert from the scope. If that was successful, fnptr function pointer would contain a reference to the alert function from the scope. But the alert function doesn't exist in the scope object. Thus fnptr will become no-op. And no-op is just an empty function doing nothing. And this is why the alert one fails, because the scope has no function alert defined. Okay, now we understand AngularJS expressions better. AngularJS evaluates those expressions, it parses them, and does some fancy JavaScript foo. So when you write an identifier like username, or in this case alert, into an expression, AngularJS tries in a fancy way to get the property alert from the scope object and then call this as a function. So we know now basically whatever we type in an expression, it has to exist in the scope. This is basically a JavaScript sandbox. AngularJS expressions are kinda JavaScript syntax, but are parsed and evaluated by Angular, and you are only allowed to access variables on functions from the scope object. You are not allowed to access global functions like alert or the cookies. Now we want to break out of the scope object and try to access those dangerous global functions. So here it comes. How can we break out of the scope? The scope object is like any other JavaScript object. It automatically has the property constructor. The constructor of the scope object gives us the object constructor. And the constructor of the object constructor gives us the function constructor. That's like the highest constructor in JavaScript. The constructor of a function constructor is again the function constructor. And we have just learned what the function constructor can do from getterFn. We can create an arbitrary JavaScript function. So for example, we can create a function containing the code alert1. The constructor created now a new JavaScript function. And then we can call this function by adding parentheses and get an alert. So because we can get the function constructor from the scope by using constructor 2 times, we should be able to create a function with alert and execute that. At least it seems to work in the console. Does it also work in an AngularJS expression? To put it into an Angular expression, we simply have to remove the scope in the beginning, because each expression gets already evaluated against the scope. So let's put it in there and try it. So the first breakpoint is again the getterFn function. And when we look at the dynamic code that got generated, this time we see it attempts to get the constructor of s. So that seems to work. This means it will then later try to get the property constructor of the scope, which obviously does exist, and that looks good. And if we let the code just run, we get the alert. Awesome. In the next part of the series, we will have a look at a more advanced and more recent bypass for AngularJS version 1.47.